Welcome to Bedtime Haunting, the podcast where the past isn't silent and forgotten places speak again. Each week, we uncover the real histories behind the world's most mysterious places. Stories of silence, memory, and endurance. I'd love to hear from you. Tell me where you're tuning in from. Share your ideas for future episodes in the comments, or leave a rating wherever you listen. This is Season 1, The Asylums of History. The water at Seneca Lake holds its breath before dawn. A faint mist hangs over the surface, rising from the black water like something remembering itself. Across the still expanse, the first light of morning touches the red brick and limestone of Willard State Hospital, a long, solemn shape at the water's edge. From a distance, it could be a college or a monastery. Up close, the windows tell another story. When the Willard Asylum for the Chronic Insane opened in 1869, it was a gesture of mercy in an age that still confused madness with sin. New York State had built dozens of almshouses and poor farms to hide its unwanted, but Willard promised something different. Treatment, not confinement. It was meant for those who had nowhere else to go, people labeled incurable, but still deemed human enough to deserve sunlight and air. The architect, William H. Wilcox, designed it to resemble a self-contained village. Wards for men and women, workshops, barns, laundry houses, even a cemetery. The lake shimmered beside it like a mirror of redemption. The first patient was a woman named Mary Rote. She arrived in chains from the Columbia County poorhouse, where she had lived for 10 years in a wooden cage. When the attendants cut the ropes that bound her wrists, she wept without speaking. Her case was cited in the press as proof that civilization was advancing, that compassion could be institutionalized. The newspapers called her release a triumph of humane progress. They did not say that Mary spent the rest of her life at Willard, dying there nearly 40 years later. Willard's founding coincided with a moment of reform across America. Dorothea Dix, the tireless advocate for the mentally ill, had spent decades urging legislators to replace punishment with care. She believed that order, work, and calm surroundings could lead broken minds toward recovery. Willard was her vision made brick and iron. Its first superintendent, Dr. John P. Gray, echoed that philosophy. "Idleness," he wrote, "is the root of decay." Patients would be healed through labor, purpose, and exposure to the beauty of the natural world. The grounds were vast, over 400 acres, rolling gently toward the lake. There were orchards and vegetable gardens, stables for horses, and fields that shimmered green in summer and brittle gold in autumn. The asylum was self-sufficient, almost proud of its isolation. Every building had its function, every patient a task. From dawn until the evening bell, there was motion. Men building fences or cutting firewood, women sewing sheets or sorting laundry. The idea was simple. That structure could save. But there was something else in that structure too. Containment disguised as care. The wards were airy yet locked, the windows large yet barred. The smell of soap and starch lingered in every corridor. The patients moved through a world designed to appear gentle but engineered to control every breath of their day. From the superintendent's office, the lake looked tranquil, obedient to the wind. From the wards, it was a horizon they could see but never touch. On calm nights, the sound of the water carried through the open vents, soft and repetitive, a kind of lullaby that belonged to no one. Some patients swore they could hear voices in the waves, calling, pleading, remembering. The nurses told them it was imagination, but even the attendants admitted that the wind off Seneca had a peculiar tone. It moaned across the brickwork as if the lake itself kept count of the years passing inside. Willard was meant to heal through order, but beneath its tidy lawns, the soil remembered what it was built on: an old steamboat dock, a burial ground for soldiers from the nearby war camp, and a fault line of human longing that would never entirely settle. By the turn of the century, Willard had become a small, self-contained world, a town of the forgotten that fed, clothed, and buried itself. From the water, passing boats could see smoke curling from the hospital chimneys, hear the clatter of laundry pulleys, the faint rhythm of footsteps on gravel. It was an institution run on precision. Bells dictated every movement. Even silence had its appointed hour. Morning began with the rising whistle. Patients were roused from long iron-framed beds, sheets folded with military neatness. They washed in tin basins, queued for porridge, and marched out under the supervision of attendants whose faces were set somewhere between kindness and fatigue. Work was therapy, and everyone worked. The men mended boots, sawed timber, and tended the gardens. The women sewed uniforms, pressed linen, and filled endless jars of preserved fruit for winter. The grounds were immaculate, lawns trimmed, hedges squared, pathways swept until they shone. Dr. Gray, the superintendent, insisted that order cured chaos. "We must show them what sanity looks like," he wrote in one report, "until they learn again to imitate it." To the outside world, it sounded noble. To those inside, it was a law. Each building carried its own rhythm. The sewing room hummed like a hive, needles flashing in rows. The bakery smelled of yeast and ash. In the laundry, steam rose in heavy clouds, wrapping the attendants in a fog that made it impossible to tell sweat from condensation. Above the boiler house, the superintendent's residence stood serene, its wide verandas facing the lake. Visitors were often impressed. They wrote in their diaries that Willard was a place of surprising peace. Few stayed long enough to notice how that peace depended on silence. Medical practice, such as it was, hovered between science and faith. The doctors believed in hydrotherapy, cold compresses, fresh air, and the curative power of work. Restraints were discouraged, but never entirely gone. Isolation rooms waited behind heavy doors. Drugs were rare and primitive: bromides, morphine, whiskey tonics, used as much to calm as to heal. Treatment records spoke in euphemism: agitation reduced, appetite restored, patient compliant. No one recorded what it meant to live without a name, only a diagnosis. Yet within the machinery, compassion flickered. Nurses smuggled extra bread to the thin, whispered hymns during evening rounds, slipped letters into outgoing mail for patients who still had families. Some kept journals of their own, describing small acts of grace that never reached the reports. "Mrs. F. laughed today," one wrote. "She does not remember why. It was a good sound, Seasons gave the place its rhythm. In spring, the orchards behind the main building exploded with blossom, and for a few days the air smelled almost sweet. In summer, heat pressed into the wards until tempers rose. Autumn was harvest. Wheelbarrows full of cabbages and potatoes rattling down the paths. Winter, though, was the hospital's true mood, long corridors echoing with the hiss of radiators, the world outside locked in ice. The patients who improved were transferred to the parole wards, where they could walk the grounds freely under supervision. From the verandas, they looked toward the lake, so near that in the mornings they could see the reflection of the clouds moving across its surface. Sometimes they imagined stepping beyond the gates, boarding one of the passenger boats that cut across Seneca. But the guards at the landing were always polite, always firm. Maybe tomorrow, they'd say. Willard's design made escape impossible, but it left room for dreaming. The lake remained visible from almost every window, a promise both soothing and cruel. For the patients, it became a clock that never stopped, each ripple marking another hour of endurance. By the 1920s, Willard had swollen far beyond its intent. Built for 600, it now held over 2,400 patients. The corridors, once bright with morning light, grew dim with bodies and beds. Metal cots were crammed into day rooms, attics were converted into dormitories. The hum of order had turned into the drone of endurance. Still, the reports spoke of progress, and the state sent more. Medicine was changing, but not always for the better. The new superintendent, Dr. George Cook, embraced modern techniques, some merciful, others misguided. Hydrotherapy returned in elaborate form, patients wrapped in soaked sheets or submerged in tepid baths for hours to calm the nerves. Later came insulin coma therapy, shock treatments, and crude psychosurgery. What began as moral reform had evolved into a laboratory for the uncertain. Each innovation arrived with optimism, each faded into routine. The charts filled with notes, written in the same careful hand: reaction positive, sleep improved, patient unresponsive, repeat tomorrow. For the attendants who carried out the orders, routine became its own refuge. You stopped asking if it worked, one nurse later recalled. You just did the work. Outside the wards, the world changed faster than the hospital could follow. The Great Depression sent hundreds more to Willard. Farmers bankrupted, veterans adrift, families fractured. Many arrived not because they were ill, but because there was nowhere else to go. Poverty was reclassified as insanity, and Willard became the state's overflow. Even the cemetery grew crowded. Behind the orchard, rows of numbered iron markers lined the grass. No names, only digits. The staff adapted in silence. They organized picnics for the patients, small concerts in the assembly hall, a Christmas pageant where attendants played shepherds and angels. A local photographer captured one such event in 1932. A row of women in white dresses holding paper stars, smiling toward the camera. The photo was later used in a state report to prove the hospital's success. It said nothing about the locked wards behind them or the patients who never came outside. In summer, the lake still glimmered, but few had time to notice. The fields that once symbolized renewal were now overgrown, the farm laborers too old or too medicated to keep pace. The machinery of care had become a mechanism of containment. During the Second World War, the hospital's population peaked. Supplies ran thin. Food was rationed again. Some of the younger doctors were drafted. The remaining staff worked double shifts. A nurse's diary from 1943 records a haunting entry. No more bandages. We boil what we have. The patients are quiet now, but it feels like waiting for something that will not come. After the war, the vocabulary changed once more. The word asylum fell out of favor. Willard became a hospital. Yet the transformation was mostly linguistic. The walls remained. The gates stayed locked. The staff adopted new titles: psychologists, social workers. But their daily duties remained the same: keeping order, managing the forgotten. By the 1950s, television crews and journalists occasionally visited, curious about life inside. They were given the official tour, the neat wards, the dining hall, the crafts room. Cameras never lingered in the basement corridors, where wheelchairs lined the walls like a silent parade. The patients who could speak rarely did. Decades of sedation had slowed their words, their hands trembling from years of medication, yet some still found ways to express themselves. A nurse remembered one woman who hummed the same tune every day for 30 years. When asked what it was, she said simply, "The river." It was the rhythm of Seneca, carrying on beyond the fences, a sound of motion for those who had none. When the century turned, Willard's world began to contract. The great institutions that had once defined American psychiatry were falling from grace. Across the country, the movement toward deinstitutionalization promised care in the community rather than confinement behind walls. Politicians praised the idea. Social workers believed in it. For those who lived and worked at Willard, it was simply the beginning of the end. The wards emptied slowly. By the 1970s, entire wings stood quiet except for the creak of radiators and the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Paint peeled from the ceilings like thin paper. Ivy pushed through the window frames. The smell of bleach and dust became the hospital's dominant scent. The staff that remained moved like caretakers of memory rather than medicine. One by one, patients were released to halfway houses or nursing homes. Some returned to families who no longer knew them. Others vanished into the social safety net, their records ending mid-sentence. The hospital's archives swelled with abandoned charts, photographs, and uncollected possessions. The great dream of humane reform had completed its circle, beginning in hope, ending in paperwork. Then, in 1995, a maintenance worker discovered something in one of the old attics above the administration building. Behind a row of rusted lockers, he found a wooden door bolted shut from the outside. When it was opened, the beam of his flashlight caught rows upon rows of dust-covered suitcases stacked nearly to the ceiling, over 400 in all. Each carried a patient's name tag, faded with age. Anna D., 1926. Frank B., 1913. Margaret M., 1947. Inside were the lives the world had mislaid. Dresses carefully folded, a photograph of a dog, shaving brushes, rosaries, ration books, postcards never sent. Some still smelled faintly of lavender, others of mothballs and paper. The discovery was accidental, but what it revealed was extraordinary. A century of voices preserved by neglect. Archivists were called in, then historians. They cataloged the contents carefully, treating each case as a biography. The names were matched to patient records where possible. Some had died within months of arriving at Willard. Others had lived there for decades. Few had ever left. The suitcases offered a new kind of history, not of medicine, but of humanity. They told stories the ledgers could not, of people who once believed they were only passing through, who packed their best clothes and family photographs expecting a short stay. Hope, it turned out, was the most common item found among them. In one case, a woman named Ethel carried a wedding dress that had yellowed with time. She was committed at age 24 for what the doctors described as melancholic withdrawal. She died at 81, never discharged. Another, belonging to a man named Albert, contained a book of poems with the first page torn out. Someone had written in pencil on the inside cover, "To keep the mind from wandering too far." When the suitcases went on exhibition, thousands came to see them. People wept in front of the glass displays. Teachers brought their students. Journalists wrote about the attic of forgotten souls. But for those who had once worked at Willard, the reaction was more complicated. They weren't ghosts, one former nurse said. They were our people. We remember them. The discovery did not redeem the institution, but it reframed it. Willard was no longer just a symbol of confinement. It became a museum of endurance, a reminder that even within the machinery of control, individuality persisted. In handwriting, in objects, in the stubborn habit of hope. By the time Willard finally closed its gates in 1995, the river and the wind were the only constants left. The last patients were transferred to community homes, and the remaining staff gathered for a quiet ceremony in the administration hall. Someone played a hymn on an old piano. Another read from a notebook found in a patient's locker. There were no speeches of victory, only a deep, exhausted silence. Outside, Seneca Lake reflected the late autumn light. For the first time in more than a century, the buildings stood empty. Corridors that had echoed with footsteps now held only the creak of pipes and the sigh of wind through broken panes. The echo of routine, bells, footsteps, the rhythm of breath, dissolved into memory. Nature moved in as if it had been waiting. Swallows nested in the eaves. Vines climbed through shattered windows. The fields reclaimed their shape. From the lake, the asylum seemed to sink back into the landscape, becoming once more part of the valley rather than its keeper. The institution that had once held thousands was reduced to stillness and dust. But silence, as history teaches, is never empty. The discovery of the suitcases had given the place a second voice, and that voice began to spread. Artists, historians, and descendants of former patients came to Willard, drawn by a sense that something sacred lingered in the ruins. They described it not as haunted, but as listening. The air itself seemed to wait for acknowledgement. In 2011, a new exhibition opened at the New York State Museum, The Lives They Left Behind. Visitors moved slowly among rows of illuminated cases, each containing a single suitcase. Beneath the glass, time had been translated into objects. A comb, a notebook, a photograph, a pair of spectacles. Each item was ordinary, yet together they spoke of something vast and human. The desire to be remembered. One display contained a small mirror, its silver backing tarnished. A note inside the suitcase read, so I can see if I am still here. That line, simple and heartbreaking, became the exhibition's unspoken motto. For the people of Seneca County, Willard remains a paradox. Some remember it as a place of cruelty, others as a necessary refuge. Its history resists simplification. It was both sanctuary and prison, mercy and control. Like the water beside it, it reflects whatever light you cast upon it. Even now, the lake whispers against the shore. Fishermen say the water there runs colder, denser, as though it holds what the land could not. On clear days, the ruins shimmer faintly through the trees, the brickwork dulled to the color of silt. Those who visit often fall quiet without knowing why. They say the air feels heavy, but not unkind. In the end, Willard's story is not one of madness, but of endurance, of people whose lives were folded into silence and then unfolded again by chance. The suitcases did not free them, but they restored their presence. And in doing so, they reminded the world that history is not written by institutions, but by the small, persistent traces left behind. The lake remains the final witness. Its surface mirrors the sky, its depths keep their secrets. When the wind moves across it at dusk, it sounds almost like breathing. Slow, patient, unending, the river's mouth opens, and the story continues. Subscribe to Bedtime Haunting on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube for new episodes every week.